I'm Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Clean up your damn room. Stand up straight with your shoulders back and listen to the Patrick Coffin Show.
Hey, this is the Patrick Coffin Show. What causes atheism? Are all atheists simply people of reason and they've carefully considered the data and they've come to conclusions based on the evidence alone? Was there something else, something more psychological, emotional going on behind so much atheism we see today? Atheists are on the rise, numbers-wise, and today we're going to dive deep into a major source of the worldview known as atheism. His name is Dr. Paul Vitz, and he's written a fine book. It's been reissued by Ignatius Press. It's called Faith of the Fatherless, the Psychology of Atheism. Coming up straight ahead on the Patrick Coffin Show. Glad to have you. Dr. Paul Vitz is a professor of psychology and senior scholar at the Institute for the Psychological Sciences. He's written many books in the area of religion and culture and the relationship between the self and society. His latest book, as I mentioned, is called Faith of the Fatherless, the Psychology of Atheism. I'll just show it here on the screen. Dr. Vitz, so great to connect with you again.
Well, terrific. Glad to see you again.
There's more data. It seems every month there's a new atheist author who has popped up, thinking he or she has some new spin, new theory on it. A lot of the, maybe we can start with something I've noticed, and that is that the preponderance of at least public atheists tend to be male. They tend to be middle-aged males who are really into it. You know, they're either in their mom's basement, or they're going to these conferences, or they show up on comm boxes on internet sites, but overwhelmingly male. Is that just me, or is there data to support that?
It's true, actually. It has been since atheists began organizing roughly 100 years ago. It's been a much more of a male thing. And there are reasons for that, too, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of the thesis of your book. You've done a sort of a psychohistory, if you will, of a good number of representative atheists, from David Hume and Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Schopenhauer, lots of them. And then so from the Enlightenment era to the what we nickname the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, the late Christopher Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins, and they all seem to have one biographical backstory fact in common, which is what?
The common backstory is a bad relationship with their father or a father figure. Mm-hmm. And that shows up over and over again. Now, I looked at that historically. I would like to point out something about Dawkins. Mm-hmm. Dawkins was hostile to Christianity and religion when he was in public school, what we would call a private prep school.
Right.
This was long before he became a scientist. He went to a Church of England school that was had still in the 40s, when he was there, mm-hmm. middle, late 40s, I think. When he was there, it had required chapel. And he got so upset about required chapel that he really resisted very, very strongly. And eventually the headmaster or assistant headmaster, after talking with Dawkins and with his father and so on, agreed to let him not go to chapel. So the single thing to keep in mind is that his hostility to religion occurred prior to his actual public atheism or anything like that. He's not a scientist when he's sitting there in prep school when he's, 14 or whatever. Yeah. But he's already intensely rejecting chapel. And so what's going on? Well, the one thing we do know is that not too long before that, he was sexually abused or got involved in a negative way with a representative of the Church of England. Mm-hmm. With a C of E cleric of some kind who was there at the school. And of course, he's gotten over that in terms of his own mind, I suppose, in terms of his conscious experience. But you can imagine that negative experience with a father figure was quite important.
Yeah.
But in any case, it points out that his atheism was preceding his training as a scientist by some years. So you have to talk about his psychology, not his mind.
Sure. I've had some email exchanges a few years ago with Dr. Dawkins, and he has defended what I would call mild pedophilia more than once. He sort of just, kind of dismissed the idea that this is a trauma that's long-lasting. I think it's as though he's trying to continually domesticate what happened to him, and kind of.
Yes, I didn't know that, but that would.
Yeah.
Yes, that would make sense. Certainly, good psychological sense.
Maybe we can segue
That's
from.
just
Yeah. What's that?
There are others who had problems with their fathers, and so forth. Of the what did you call them? The four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Yeah, Dennett, Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens.
Hitchens had all kinds of problems.
Maybe we can linger there. And by the way, just for the audience, we're not trying to uncover skeletons or humiliate people or point fingers. We're just looking at the biographical facts of public atheist leaders and how their own relationships with their fathers has oriented them toward accepting the atheism worldview. Sigmund Freud, as you point out, said that God is an exalted father. Well, right. Freud was right, but just not in the way he thought. And so you have someone like Dawkins, whose own father. I mean, I think that Americans maybe don't understand the British mindset of going away to public school. It's a kind of a rite of passage, and separation from parents at a delicate time is something that the English have had more experience than I think than we do over here on this side of the pond. But you've got a father figure who's not there, and then another father figure interposes himself in an abusive way and molests young Richard. That's got to have an effect on how he views the whole concept of father.
And religion, because they were so big with the particular abuser. Yeah,
and that in his case, a representative of the religion.
Yes.
Not just an incidental. Christopher Hitchens is a very complex figure to me. He writes. I mean, he wrote, rest his soul, with a very kind of aggressive verve. He's like an organized tornado. You never know what position he's going to take. I often enjoyed reading Christopher Hitchens, and most people don't know that he was publicly pro-life. He defended the pro-life position. I understand that his mother had at least one abortion. And his mother and father broke up. And then tell us a little bit about his sort of stepfather, substitute father experience and how that was devastating to Hitchens.
Well, first, there is possibility that his own father, from whom he felt a great deal of distance, he didn't feel close to his father, although he had modest respect for him because of his war service. Mm-hmm. But his father might have been instrumental in the not just accepting, possibly even pushing for the abortion. Mm. So that's one thing to keep in the background. But to make it bring it more up to date for Christopher Hitchens, he was this happened in the early 60s, and he was, I think, roughly a junior or senior at Oxford. Mm-hmm. And his mother comes to him and tells him that she's going to get a divorce. And so his mother tells him about the divorce before even his own father knew it was coming. Mm-hmm. But what had happened was she had found a new man, a new love of her life. And the man she found was an ex-Church of England reverend. And so he speaks of him, that is, Hitchens speaks of this man as the ex-rev in his autobiography. Mm-hmm. And the ex-rev was kind of a vague, poetic type, and apparently his mother and he were enamored of each other, and they had decided to go off to India and study with the Maharishi. This was at the time that the Beatles were involved in the same thing.
Yeah, the hippie era, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. I remember it well. But anyway, just before she left, she had a luncheon with Christopher and told him about this. And a little bit afterwards, she left. But just before she left, she said she's going to visit India with him, with the ex-rev, and they would stop in Greece and then go on the way from there to India. Mm-hmm. Well, sometime later, I don't know, maybe a week or so, I'm not sure how long it was, he got a phone call from one of his friends, and she said, by the way, I see that a woman by the name that has the same name as your mother was found murdered in a hotel in Greece. And he said, what? Oh, no. And he checked it out. And sure enough, his mother was dead and apparently murdered in a hotel room in Greece. So he flies out there to check on what happened and discovers that what seems to have happened is that there was a suicide pact, a mutual suicide pact with the ex-rev and his mother. Now, he thought his mother was in a very upbeat mood, looking forward, was excited about the new life that was opening up. And so from Dawkins' point of view, from Christopher Hitchens' point of view, there was no possible explanation for his mother's suicide unless this ex-rev had been the pressure on it, or had somehow or other finagled it or killed her and then decided to kill himself or what have you. So here's this ex-rev who is responsible for the death of his mother in Hitchens' point of view. And there it is, another reason for not being this new stepfather, again, a representative, as he keeps calling him, the ex-rev of religion, he felt was responsible for the death of his mother, to whom he was quite devoted.
And this is perhaps under the, well, you've got several categories in your book: atheists and their fathers, abusive and weak fathers. There's an overlap here, Dr. Vitz. Let me toss this at you. My tagline is "We go there," so let me go there. There seems to be an overlap of experience between atheists who had abusive, distant, or early dead fathers, and homosexuals who very frequently note the same kind of causative factors that led to their own same-sex attraction. Is there a large overlap between homosexuals and atheists?
Not that I know.
Not that you know of.
Not
you
my
see,
impression.
there's a similarity there of the backstory, though.
There might be, but I just don't know. I have to plead ignorance to your question. Okay,
well, the follow-up to that then is that it doesn't matter if let's say the atheists, sometimes you'll hear this, this theory is false because I have a great relationship with my dad. It's hard to parse out exceptions. Perhaps they prove the rule. But
there are lots of exceptions, yes.
Isn't it the perception that's more important than the objective reality? I mean, if you perceived your father as passive and your mother as completely domineering, even if your dad just doing the best he could, that the perception of not being involved in the son's life seems like a more salient factor than something that you could objectively prove.
Yes,
do you see what I'm saying?
The perception or the interpretation given to what happened.
Right.
And it's very important. And for example, Nietzsche, who lost his father, who's the most famous atheist of all, who said, quite frankly, his atheism had nothing to do with reason. He knew it by instinct, which meant he knew it by a kind of unconscious motivation. And he despised his father because his father was sickly and died. His father was also a minister, and therefore again represented not just the father as an image of God, but the actual representation of religion directly. And he considered his father weak and sickly, and that's how he described Christianity. And he described Christianity as a religion for women because he was surrounded by women after his father died. And he never had, that is, Nietzsche never had a good father substitute. But he kept looking for the father. And the name of the father in Nietzsche's philosophy was the Superman, das Übermensch. And he kept looking for this. And there's a biography of Nietzsche called In Search of the Father.
Interesting. It's like he grabbed for the false substitute of hypermasculinity.
Yes.
Which is a false alternative, right?
That's a good way to put it.
What about writers like Albert Camus, the novelist? I guess Jean-Paul Sartre was also a philosopher and novelist. Two French, more higher name recognition. Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is other people. I remember that famous line from him. What was his father like? What was that story?
His father died when he was quite young, and there's also a biography of Sartre. with a kind of subtext trying to find the father. And Sartre was preoccupied with negative things about fathers all his life. He says there's nothing worse than it's okay to be a husband, but not to paternity is the whole terrible thing. And he explicitly said, once God the Father is dead, you now define your essence. You define who you are. And that's a quote from his major work. And so he was preoccupied with fathers and critical of them all his life. But his own father died when he was about a year old or so, and he had a stepfather whom he hated or despised and who got in the way of his love with his mother.
You have some control group comparisons, people who were from that era, who wrote, who were thinkers and journalists like Hilaire Belloc and Chesterton, or substitute fathers, St. John Bosco. How frequent is it, or how rare is it, put the other way, to have someone with a strong, salient father presence and a healthy religious experience in a Christian home? Does that skew the data to make it far less likely that one will become an atheist?
I would think so, yes. I would. And by the way, fathers are the more important parent in the passing on of the religion. Mothers are important. They have evidence for that, but there's even more evidence that fathers are especially important, even more than the mothers in passing on the religious tradition, because it's they who represent religion in any social or public way in terms of how your identity is formed in dealing with other people.
Is that because... I'm sorry. Go ahead. What was that last part?
So that's where it's really important, where the father is he's the Mr. Outside who who gives you your identity to the people you meet outside. And when he loves, and the crucial thing about your father is not so much how masculine he is, it's just how much he shows affection and support.
Mm-hmm. How much he's there. I think
he has to be, the first thing is being there.
There's a kind of a guilt cookie concept out there that's gained some currency called quality time. I don't believe in that. I think there's only quantity time.
There's only quantity time for parents, yes. And that's for the mother too, unfortunately. Or unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm thinking about this. I give talks to men about masculine identity, and sometimes I'll get some pushback when I talk about obviously for the first 2 to 5 years, the role of the mother is indispensable. I mean, everyone listening to this or watching this today went from nothing to something inches from your mother's heart, and you were inside a woman for 9 months, and then you're surrounded by Auntie M and nurses and kindergarten and so on. But at some point, I don't know when the ideal point or when it normally happens, that father figure has to kind of cut the invisible umbilical cord that lingers and set the child on his or her own feet and endow identity. Am I overplaying the card, or is that the indispensable role of the father you're talking about?
That's his most important function, and he helps what's called in psychology individuation. He helps the child, boy or girl, to individuate, that is, to become their own separate person, and that means they have to separate from their mother. And the father can be very helpful with the daughter on that. Mm-hmm. If the daughter is too merged with the mother, or if the mother gets too much of her emotional life involved in her children, the father can reduce that by giving them another person who often leads them outside, whether it's into camping or in playing chess or tennis or fishing or going to the office. The father allows the child to individuate, to separate, to fly from the mother's nest. Mm-hmm. And this is an important part of maturing, and it's for both the boy and the girl, this individuation which the father provides.
Is this father wound more prevalent in men with respect to atheism than in women? Like, women seem to carry that father wound in a different way. It doesn't seem to as frequently manifest itself in atheism. Why is that?
Okay, here you're getting into a very interesting question, and I'll give several factors that are involved here. First of all, atheism is almost always an intellectual I won't say atheism is, but the atheism we come in contact with is almost always an intellectual position that gets built up as a philosophy, often materialistic, but not always, that is a philosophical system as separate from atheism or Christianity. Women, when they reject God, don't become atheists so much because they often find another religion. Women may find a goddess, or they may find, Simone de Beauvoir, God rest her soul, who became a public atheist along with Sartre. She explicitly said she substituted Sartre for Jesus. She had previously been very attached to Jesus, and then she substituted. So women substitute a new relationship more than a new idea or concept. So they're not as often atheists in this systematic sense. So there's some other factors involved here. Another group of men who become atheists that doesn't have anything to do, or very little to do, with their father per se, are men who suffer from, who are high in autism, that is, are somewhere on the autistic spectrum. Autistic persons have great deal, first of all, 4 out of 5 autistic children are male.
4 to 5 are male?
4 out of 5, yeah. So autism is essentially a male phenomenon. The autistic child is often rather bright in an intellectual, rational sense, but autistic children have real trouble with relationships. They have a hard time even relating positively to their mother and their father. They don't seem to understand other people have minds.
And feelings.
They can't read them very well. Sometimes it's called mind blindness and so forth. And there are degrees on the autistic spectrum. But if you can't have most Christians who are active, they have a relationship with God, commonly, particularly with Jesus. They're not Christians because they believe some abstract system per se.
Yeah.
That's nice to have as a way to understand it. But religion is a living relationship for the majority of Christians, Catholics, Protestants, you know. And it's an attachment relationship. It's a form of understanding another person and of a person relating to you. And if you can't have relationships with humans who are right in front of you, imagine how hard it would be to have a relationship with God. So there is evidence that autistic individuals are more often atheists. In fact, significantly often atheists.
In your research, did you notice trends in the biographies and the data of the lives of famous atheists that you would say as a clinician, that looks like atheism from afar? That looks like Asperger's or autism from afar.
I've come across it occasionally. It would be, I think it's very high in Silicon Valley. That is this autistic.
Everybody's high there.
Well, I know, but they have a problem with autism and with their children and everything in the Silicon Valley. And libertarians, I think, are mostly men, and that's the thing about libertarians is they're opposed to community and relationship. They want to be an autonomous individual.
Yeah, I call it the philosophy for people with no kids.
That's right, and who don't want them.
Yeah, that's right, who don't want them. Right.
And so what I would say is this is why men are more often atheists, because they'd like this autonomy. They don't have it. They're not as good at relationships. They often have this father suffering. Those all combine to make atheists disproportionately more male. Women, even when they reject God, may accept another relationship, maybe with the goddess.
Or a guru, or
or a guru,
some yoga practice community or something.
Oh yes,
Interesting.
But some
relational substitute.
Yes, relational substitute, and that could certainly, and so that's what Sartre was for Simone de Beauvoir, and it shows up in other biographies too of women. Ayn Rand had one with a fiction.
Ayn Rand. Speaking of, she's sort of the, would you call her the mother of modern libertarian political theory?
In many ways, yes.
A lot of conservatives glom onto her, and I'm always telling people that she's part of her premises are part of the problem.
Not part of the solution, yes.
Yeah. Turning to the men now, just for a moment, because the differences here in the father wound and how men and women react to that differently, it got me thinking about the atheism community online, which by definition, it's almost oxymoronic. How can you have an online community? You're not talking with human beings. It's a purely intellectual, ethereal, kind of McLuhan-esque pseudo-friendship among like-minded people.
Right.
And could you say that if women substitute relationally with, a guru or a goddess, that men substitute it something analogous to the way an alcoholic, in stopping drinking, finds community and support in the membership of AA? There's atheist members of AA, and their higher powers is the strength they find in the group. Could the group be a kind of substitute for a church community among male atheists? Does that make sense?
Yes, but I think a lot of it is just plain intellectual support that they want. Mm-hmm. They're not really interested in the other person so much as a person. They're just interested in the words and the information and the logic and the system that they communicate. Mm-hmm. For example, if occasionally you'll run into an autistic young person who is interested in religion, but they tend to be interested either in ritual and liturgy, or they're interested in theology, but not in what we would call prayer, meditation, experiential.
Right, a living relationship with Jesus Christ as a person.
As a person, yes. But women also get involved. The New Age thing. They get involved. They may get involved with, their earlier lives, when they were Cleopatra.
Yeah, they're never a garbage. They're never a garbage collector or like a toilet cleaner. They're always a queen or Vizier. Yeah, but look,
I know that's true, but we should recognize that Christianity responds to that desire, which is in the heart, not just of women. It's the same thing in the heart of men. Every man wants to be a prince. Mm-hmm. The hero.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Dragon Slayer.
A dragon slayer. And by the way, when you're a child of God, you are a prince or a princess. You're a child of the king.
King's kids, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought about that. How many times have I heard the phrase royal priesthood? That just hit it right there.
And so, we have, Christians, we weren't that in a past life. Mm-hmm. We're going to be that in the future life.
That's a great pithy way to summarize that. You talk about intense atheism in your book, which is almost like a fanatical emotional attachment to the worldview. I've run into this in debating atheists here and there. It reminds me of a line from C.S. Lewis. I believe it's from his book Surprised by Joy, his spiritual autobiography. When I was an atheist, he said, I knew God didn't exist, and I was very angry with him for not existing.
Well, that's possible.
Pretty delicious little insight
That's
there.
Delicious. I don't know. The psychology of individual atheists, I pass on because people are really complicated.
Yeah.
Just like every example of how the Father can disappoint you is varies from person to person in all kinds of ways. And it can be quite unconscious. It can be very unconscious. I caught Albert Ellis in that. Maybe you read that. The RET found a rational emotive therapy. That was very interesting. Tell us the Albert Ellis anecdote, because there was a potty-mouthed pioneer. Yeah, well, Ellis, look, he made many positive contributions to psychology, and he did it. And I'll explain a little bit about his background. Well, first, he and I were both speakers at a conference in Texas, I think in Dallas, sponsored, I think, by a Baptist seminary, if my memory's right.
That's a mashup.
Yeah, and what they had were a series of speakers from the sciences and disciplines, where they had one speaker who was an atheist and one who was a theist, and they would present first one, then the other, and the audience would be there, and questions could be asked, and so on. Well, the theist, I was selected as the psychologist who was the theist, and Albert Ellis, who was well known to be publicly critical of religion and an atheist, was selected to be the atheist. Well, Ellis got up there and began speaking to this audience, which was largely, I think, Southern Baptists and colleagues and friends and so forth. But anyway, and he called prayer ass licking.
Beautiful.
Beautiful, right? And I saw it roll down the audience like a wave of shock and so on.
Baptists love that kind of content, yeah.
Oh, he loved that, but they sort of said, well, gee, I heard people like this existed probably in New York City, and they really do. Here is one. Well, then I got up and I gave my defective father hypothesis as a source of atheism. And he heard it. Okay, we walked out afterwards, and he looked at me, and I looked at him as we walked out together, and he said, well, I got on fine with my father. And I said, well, it's a psychological hypothesis, and if it accounts for even 40 or 50% of the sample, that's doing very well for a particular psychological theory. Okay, we got back to New York, both of us, and anyway, I was talking to an editor who was a friend of mine, and I mentioned I had given this talk. He said, send me the paper, will you? And I did. And about a couple of weeks later, he called me back and we were talking. And he said, by the way, your thesis fits Albert Ellis perfectly. And I said, what? He says, I read that paper to him. He heard it and he told me he got on fine with his father. And I talked to his name was George. I said, George, how could you know differently? And he says, well, we are publishing his biography. And I was reading the page proofs last night. And you might like to know something about his father. Well, when Ellis was a boy of around 8 or 10, his father abandoned the family and was seen in the neighborhood every now and then. And Albert and his brother, who was, I can't remember whether he was about the same age, but I think maybe a little older, took care of the family and took care of their mother, who was not in a very good mental or physical state. So these two boys in the 20s and 30s in New York City kept that family together, and their father every now and then would float around, or he'd hear about him. He was known to be a philanderer. And so on and so forth. But you can't tell me two kids of that age in New York wouldn't have been angry as could be at a father who had abandoned them, wasn't helping, and putting all the burden on them. Yeah,
it's too much for him to admit publicly that you had his number in a way.
Yeah, he couldn't rationally, he couldn't get in touch with his emotions.
A lot of people get wrapped up, Dr. Vitz, in this the language of Scripture, where God as Father, where Jesus reveals God as Father. I think that the feminist movement inside the Catholic Church since the 60s has wanted to conclude that was an arbitrary metaphor that Jesus kind of threw out there because it would make sense to a Jewish culture. Now, the Church and Scripture both testify that God is not a male. God does not have a male body, no male DNA. And yet, for Jesus to reveal God as Father is not just a word game. It's not just a kind of a metaphorical idea. It's an ontological reality, because that seems to be the keystone to your psychological hypothesis here, that rejection of the earthly father kind of preternaturally disposes one to rejecting the true Father, the eternal Father.
Yes. Absolutely. And look, Jesus did not come. Look, it isn't as though God it has a body. That isn't what we're talking about. But Jesus, his most creative and innovative thing besides his resurrection was his language for describing God. And the Jews don't want to call God Father. There was a little bit of that in the Old Testament, but they're certainly avoiding it now.
Yeah.
If you mention this to a Muslim, he's going to walk out of the room.
Correct.
So what I'm trying to say is Jesus is telling us something about the ultimate nature of how we can arrive at contact with God. And God has to be both loving and strong and disciplining. And it's as though the metaphor would be a picture of a baby held by the mother and then released by the mother as the baby ran to the love of the father. And in that, we are all strengthened and affirmed. And of course, for Catholics, we have Our Lady there as a sign of the importance of women and motherhood. And there's, so I think that critique by the feminists is basically kind of silly. Unconvincing.
You came from an atheistic background.
Yes.
What's the short version? I'm sure it's a longer story than we have here, but was it an encounter with Christ? Was it a singular grace? And did your own father's role angle you toward atheism when you were younger?
I think there were some ways in which my father's role did angle me toward atheism. He was present, but I do know we argued a lot. And it bothered my mother and even my brothers. And so I go off to college.
Yeah.
And appropriately enough, in my sophomore year, I become an atheist. I read Bertrand Russell, and it sounds so much more masculine and strong, not to have to depend on anyone. And I became a classic example of someone with attachment anxiety, who then became, then poo-pooed attachments as important. I didn't need anybody. I could live in a tower in the middle of the wood, watch fires, and be happy as a clam.
The prophet Paul Simon, you're a rock, you're an island.
Yeah, I'm an island. Exactly. I had, that's the way to live, You don't need anybody, which is, a kind of attachment anxiety. All right, I was like that all through graduate school. And my wife and I, when we got married, we were both atheists. And we made up our own wedding vows without any reference to God. And God came anyway, of course. But the thing that was there were two things I can say that were very important for me. One was the birth of our first child, our daughter, Rebecca. It really was a kind of wake-up call. Hey, grow up. You're not just this kid who's running around with a chip on his shoulder or whatever, trying to prove he can, what do you have to give to this child who you'll know all your life and will be important to you? And there probably will be others. Who are you? What kind of man are you? What do you stand for?
Yeah.
And so that was a big challenge. And I knew already about self-worship. That's what most of the secularists that I knew, everything was their career and all of that, and nothing else. But I knew that people who worship themselves always worshiped a fool. So anyway, that was a big one. The other one was that my wife also had a kind of wake-up call, and we went on the journey together. So that's a second factor. And the third factor is we met a lot of very intelligent priests and very supportive priests who were wise and very intelligent. And they, the idea that you had to be a dummy to be a believer was immediately scotched.
You see the importance. There's another series of father figures stepping in.
You bet.
Kind of the inverse opposite of what happened to Dawkins.
Yeah, a bunch of them. These were very good priests. They're Father Benedict Groeschel was one.
Yeah,
Father Malachi Martin was another. Father Newhouse was a third. And in addition, there were two that are not known outside of the city or anything.
I have to ask you, did you ever meet Bishop Sheen?
No.
I know he was also in New York, probably the time you were, maybe after.
I don't. But I didn't get in contact with him.
Let's close with this, Dr. Vitz, because we've talked about the problem and the intense atheism and the fatherlessness and your hypothesis. I wanted to ask you about the balance that the Catholic faith provides between the masculine and the feminine. You mentioned Our Lady. Yeah. There's something when people say, oh, Catholicism is a patriarchal religion, I have to chuckle because, yeah, God is Father, and we have priests who are the public, instantiations, if you will, the representatives.
Fathers. Yeah, they're the
fathers,
substitute fathers for many people who need them, like those priests were for me.
But Mary's the mother of the church. We call the church our mother. The church is called bride. So there's this magnificent balance there between masculine and feminine.
Yes. All I can say is right on. The Catholic Church has a huge... Look, we have recently now a fourth doctor of the church who's a woman. And there's...
Edith Stein?
No, Hildegard of Bingen.
Oh, right. Under Pope Benedict, Hildegard of Bingen, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to say is, and there are all kinds of female saints who talk to the popes and tell them when they should come back,
right.
Go from Avignon and go back to Rome and how to shape up.
Yeah.
We have little Therese of Lisieux, whose bishop told her that she couldn't join the Carmelites, and then she goes off and talks to the Pope in Rome, and the Pope gives her a special blessing and allows her to do it. Mm-hmm. As far as I can see, I've never run into any organization or tradition that has huge respect for women like the church does. A whole series of saints and things of that kind.
Yeah.
And to have men arguing about which female saint is the better, I've heard that go on, And I've never heard that anyplace else. I'm just completely blown away.
Yeah.
And so there's an enormous respect for the difference between men and women and how they help each other when they're at their best.
Most people are not aware that there are a grand total of 0 American-born canonized male saints. There are 2 blesseds, and there's about a dozen in the pipeline, so to speak. But we have 3 females. We've got Elizabeth Ann Seton, who was canonized by Paul VI, Mother Catherine Drexel, and Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. So women are always ahead. Women are always ahead of us. We're always playing catch up. We men.
Well, the women. One of the things about Christianity is that it is a very interpersonal religion. Mm-hmm. You have a relationship with Christ, a relationship with God. Another way of putting it is, if God is your Father, who can stop you?
Right. Yeah, that's a great thought experiment.
Yeah. That's why and the other thing about the women saints in the church is they were very strong, but they always remained women. Mm-hmm. They weren't competing with masculine qualities. They were demonstrating the strength of their feminine qualities.
Right. That's key. That's key.
So the men loved them because they were pointing out to the men they should have been listening to this female concern.
Yeah, men are the game uppers. Women are the game uppers for men.
Yeah. So you better shape up.
Well, I wish the book gets what it deserves, which is a continued wide readership. It's called Faith of the Fatherless, The Psychology of Atheism. Its author, Dr. Paul Vitz, has been our guest this hour. I just feel like we've just begun to scratch the surface of the eggshell.
Yeah, there's a lot more.
Well, maybe we can come back and talk about Carl Jung and worship of the self. And I know you've got some creative things in the pipeline. Can people connect with you? Is there a website? How can folks connect if they want to find out more from you?
They can go to the Divine Mercy University website or to the IPS website. That's the Institute for the Psychological Sciences. Okay. I'm not a big tech type. So,
You're just medium-sized?
Yeah, all my children are much more than I am, and most of my colleagues. I've just mastered the telephone.
Great. Still working on the smoke signal.
Now they're disappearing everywhere.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Paul Vitz, I'll put the link to Divine Mercy University and the Institute for Psychological Sciences, along with a link to this book and the other books. Thanks for all your work. And Godspeed. It's always an honor to talk to you. I always learn a ton, so thank you.
Okay.
All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show, continuing our series on the crisis of masculinity. In the meantime, be a saint. What else is there?